Hello and welcome to the Dyson Leadership Podcast. This podcast is turning into a monthly podcast where more often than not, you're probably just going to see me jump on and do a little bit of teaching for you. So looking forward to sharing a little bit with you in this episode. And part of what I'm going to talk about is something I do a lot of training on. And this is something that's very relevant, very applicable. A lot of organizations are struggling to figure out this aspect of their current workplace environment. And so with that, going to be a topic related to the multi-generational diversity. Things have changed a little bit. I'll give you a little bit of background, a little bit of high level of why this matters and is important. So leading up to where we are now in 2025, there has been pretty regularly over the last several years, 5 separate generations in the workforce. You have the silent generation, which is the oldest generation. You have the baby boomers, which you hear a lot of conversation. They're very notable in high up management roles. A lot of your upper management and senior level positions are going to be baby boomers still. But then you're going to have Gen X, you have your millennials, and you have Gen Z. Now, the interesting thing with that is the fact that a lot of estimates say that here in 2025, Gen Z and millennials are going to make up the bulk of the workforce. They're likely going to be, over 50% of the whole workforce. A lot of the traditionals, they are filling very niche roles and are retiring at a very rapid rate, or their health is a complication and they cannot continue working. Baby boomers, a lot of them have invested in pensions and retirements, and they're all hitting retirement age and stepping aside. The ones in a lot of instances who are still working are those who they just want to keep working. They don't have a reason to necessarily as far as monetarily, but they want to keep working. They like what they do. Then you've got the Gen X, which are starting to kind of fill a lot of the senior level leadership positions that baby boomers are vacating. And in a lot of instances, you have millennials actually stepping in and taking over some of those roles, even in place of Gen X. Then you have Gen Z, who is the youngest generation coming into the workforce. So the youngest Gen Z that you would see or know is roughly about 13 years old. The oldest are going to be somewhere in their early 20s, roughly. So you're going to see, or mid-20s rather. So you're going to see a wide range where Gen Z is continuing to grow and become a pretty significant part of the workforce. Now, what I want to talk about for just a few minutes is the idea of a few communication differences and give you guys some tips. This is something that is a very, very small part of an overall training that I do normally that lasts a few hours on the multi-generational workforce. Now, this training is actually going to be available as a virtual course on my website very soon, DysonLeadership.com. Also in my area, the Catawba Valley region of North Carolina, I'm available to present the full training in person or virtually, maybe if your organization would like me to present that virtually. But I want to give you just a little bit of information because this is something that all organizations struggle with. And I don't want to charge you for this. I want you to be able to think about this and evaluate it for your own organization. Specifically in communication, it is how the different generations communicate. So what I mean by that is you might see one way of communicating as your preferred method and something you like, but the other generations, they don't view it the same way. So here's just a quick example of what that looks like. Those who are traditionals likely prefer the in-person conversation, or they would just rather no conversation. Just tell them what they need to do and let them do their job. Again, maybe not all of them, or rather in these maybe are not the typical of everybody in these generations, but they are the trends that we see. So traditionals, a lot of in-person, a lot of personal because they grew up in a time before technology. They're not going to communicate by email or text or instant messaging with Teams or Zoom or any of those things. It's not their preferred style. It's very similar with baby boomers. Now, it's a mix. You're going to see some baby boomers who are very fluent with technology. You're going to see a lot of them who are not. You're going to see a lot of them, they still lean to the in-person communication. They want to chat face-to-face. They want to have meetings. They want to be in person. All of those things. You even see it with the return to work. here in corporate America where there's the debate, remote work versus hybrid versus in person. And you see a lot of the push for return to work. And typically that is from older generations rather than the younger generations. The generational split that you see those priorities. So with that in mind, what about Gen X? Well, with Gen X, they're going to prefer likely email. That's kind of the most common that we see from research in that generation. They tend to lean more towards email corresponding. Why? Well, consider when they hit the workforce. Consider when they started. Technology and computers were starting to become more of a thing, much more common in a lot of workplaces, but there really weren't cell phones. There was not the instant message communication. There was not video chats. Emails was the primary form of communication. So with that in mind, you've now got already two very distinct communication styles. You've got some that prefer heavy in person, some that prefer heavy email. Well, let's throw millennials in the mix and we're just going to mix it all up even worse. Well, millennials, if you pick up the phone and try to call them on the phone, which is another trait baby boomers and Gen X tend to go to, phone calls. That's an easy way. That was a very common way people communicated during their early career. If you call a millennial, more often than not, that stresses them out. It causes anxiety and they don't want to pick up the phone and answer. It's a challenge for me as an entrepreneur and a business owner because I am a millennial and I don't like answering the phone, but yet I have to, and I have to force myself to pick up the phone and call potential customers, potential clients, follow up with people over phone and to answer phone calls, even though it's uncomfortable because it's expected, it's required, but it's not something I prefer. So you're going to see that as a primary communication style for millennials. Millennials then will kind of also use instant messaging and text messaging. You're going to see that as more so a preferred style for them. Even think about it. Here's a good example. If you are a millennial, or maybe you have a child that's a millennial, your friends, coworker, somebody is a millennial, ask them about how they like to receive communication from businesses. There's always that you sign up for something, check here, and you can get email follow-ups. Or a big one that's more common now is you can get text message follow-ups. For me as a millennial, anytime text message is an option, I'm going to pick that every time because I would prefer you text me or send me an instant message rather than a phone call. And I will see a text message or an instant message faster than I will a email. So it's a drastic difference now between the communication styles. So let's go ahead and throw in Gen Z, and then we'll kind of break down this a little bit, and I'll give you some recommendations. Gen Z often prefers some level of instant messaging. You'll see that trait kind of carried over from the millennials to Gen Z. But you will actually see them prefer most of the time video chats, Zoom calls, FaceTime, and those types of things. They want that personal connection of face-to-face, but they want to be able to do it where they want, when they want. You see a lot of different communication styles within these different generations. And so here is the challenge that businesses are faced with. If you rely heavily on email, you're going to alienate the millennial and the Gen Z. If you rely heavily on in-person meetings for everything, the Gen X, the Gen Z, and the millennial are going to be disrupted. If you rely heavily on just Zoom meetings, well, then you might alienate and cause some communication barriers with Gen X and baby boomers. You see how this kind of goes both ways. You have a lot of different issues. So what's the solution? Well, what I recommend to most organizations that I work with, and it's what I recommend in the multi-generational diversity training that I provide, is if you are a leader of people of different generations, try to find a balance. If it is something that doesn't disrupt and doesn't cause a lot of extra work, try to find the balance to communicate with them. So if you work on a team that's primarily millennials, can you do a group message? Can you do some type of texting system so that most of them are involved? If you work with a lot of millennials and Gen Z, can you set up Zoom meetings, virtual meetings where you guys can talk face to face? Leave it as camera optional if you want. There's options. Find what works best. If you work on a team that's majority of baby boomers and Gen X, Well, phone calls, conference calls, or in-person meetings are likely going to be your best route. Now, what happens if you work on a team that has multiple? Then if you're interacting with somebody one-on-one, try to use their preferred style. Pay attention. Watch what they respond to fastest. Here is a good example of this for you. I had a boss who very much was an email person, Gen X. And when you would send this individual an email, you would get a response fairly quickly. Now, the same individual, if you would send an instant message, then there's a really good chance it would take 2 or 3 times as long to get a response rather than if you sent an email. So what's the preferred communication style? Well, for me as a millennial working on the team, my preferred style is send an instant message. This individual's preferred style is email. If I want a quick response, send an email. If I want convenience, instant message. And when they get back to me, they get back to me. It's a little bit of a difference. Now, on the other hand, my Gen Z counterparts in different roles, instant message or a quick Zoom call or something like that tends to work really well. Find what works best communicating with your team. Now, you could have somebody that's a bit of an outlier. You could have a Gen X member of your team that prefers virtual meetings. That's possible. If that's the case and you can identify that as a priority, use it to your advantage. Find how your team communicates. I can sit here and give you all the different examples, some of the commonalities we see across the generations, but I cannot tell you how your team communicates best unless I am there with you, doing an analysis, digging into the weeds there with you. But you're working on that team. You can identify what kind of things that they do, how they respond, how they communicate faster or slower. So find what works best. The biggest thing that I want you to understand about communicating across these generational divides that even can occur is not everybody communicates the same. The same way you communicate to a baby boomer might not be the same way you need to communicate to a Gen Z. It is no longer a one-size-fits-all solution for businesses. Now, I am not saying if you have 5 different team members, you need to send individual communications to each of them. There are times you have to have group conversations, but what generally has the least resistance, causes the best productivity, and works best for everyone? Find what that is and use it. If it is the individual correspondence, what does the person prefer? When you find what their preferred style is, use it. The downside to this and where the problem really occurs, if you have somebody who you know, text message and instant messaging is their preferred style, and all you ever do is send them emails and want to meet in person, you will drive that person crazy and they will not be as productive on your team because they're not communicating in a more effective way. And you run the risk of them possibly leaving in the future to go somewhere that more aligns with their communication styles and where they can be more fulfilled. It is a risk. At the same time, let's say you have somebody who is very much an email person and you have meetings for absolutely everything. You are going to burn that person out on meetings when you could send more emails, send information, keep the meetings shorter, send as much information as you can in an email, meet in person to recap what you send in an email. That person will be more effective and more productive. At the same time, if you have somebody that they're old school and they prefer the in-person meetings and all you're doing is sending text and instant messages, they're probably not going to read them. You're going to have to go and talk to that person, pick up the phone, call them, have a quick conversation meeting with them. You have to find what works best for your team. So that is a challenge for this podcast episode. Evaluate where you are with your team. I don't care if you work in an office of 3 people, 5 people, or on a team of 10, 12, 30 people. Start to pay attention to how your team prefers to communicate. Easy way to figure that out. I'm going to give you this as a bit of advice. Easy way to figure it out for you. You as a leader, how do they reach out and contact you? If it is a person that reaches out and you realize 90% of the time they reach out and contact you, text message and instant message, guess what? That's probably their preferred style. If you realize 80, 90% of the time they reach out and send you information by email, guess what? Probably their preferred style. They have a question, they have a problem, and always when they have a question or problem, they pick up the phone and call you. Guess what? that's probably how they're going to receive information the best. If you pay attention to your team, how your team communicates, and you communicate back to them in the same way that they communicate to you in their preferred style, I guarantee you your team will be more productive, more efficient, and happy. So that's a challenge, some food for thought for this podcast episode here on the Dyson Leadership Podcast. If you found value in this, you enjoy this, be sure to leave a comment, like, subscribe, follow along wherever you consume this content. Be sure to help us get the word out, spread it, share it on social media, and share it with your team. Provide it to your team and try to collaborate. Work on improving your communication together. If you want to know more about the multi-generational workforce, multi-generational training, be sure to reach out to me, contact Dyson Leadership, and be happy to share some more information if I can. And if you're interested in the full online course or in-person training, there again, be sure to reach out. Be happy to share more information about that. Hope you enjoyed this podcast episode, and I will be here with you again next month for another episode of the Dyson Leadership Podcast.